Good day, chess world. We continue our wonderful exploration of Capablanca's best chess endgames. We're on endgame 28, nearly halfway. And this game is an endgame against Yates. And poor Mr. Frederick Yates was seemingly placed on this world by the chess gods to lose instructive endgames to Capablanca. So, yes, unfortunately, every time you see a game of Capablanca against Yates, there is some sort of instructive victory for Mr. Capablanca. And this game is very impressive. Once again, from Capablanca, it's quite intriguing. He's actually the exchange down. He sacrifices a rook for a minor piece, but it is not the material that matters, but what your pieces do for you. That is the most important theme. Actually, Capablanca enters this endgame, a full exchange down, and as we'll see, wins easily because his pieces are centralized and he has these wonderful pass pawns that he creates. So I want to remember that material is a number, but activity is the position. Let's jump right into some of the lessons from this game here. So this one here, today's session, centralize and convert. We're going to see Capablanca dominate the center with his central pawns, and that will be the defining point because he will have more space cutting off the opposing pieces. Now, the first theme I want you to see is win the trades. Trade into your strength. This becomes important for you to try and think about, if I'm going to trade off pieces, what am I aiming for? Have that intention. The second one is the centralized pieces harvest in this case, where we're going to see that those pieces that are aimed at the middle are so good at taking over the middle. Absolutely wonderful. And then we want to build pass pawns, strip the defender and build those pass pawns, as we'll see in this case. Because normally, as we've seen to create pass pawns, it's about advancing a majority. This one was real simple from Capablanca. Destroy the defenders of the pawns, win them, and then you're creating new pass pawns. And then finally, we're going to look at the idea of the central pass pawns storming down the board with tempo, with threats, taking it all away from the opponent. So let's jump into our end game and part of the big theme, because I want us to focus on the basics of plan number 1 and 2. Today's one is focused on plan number 2 in the end game. So here we have our wonderful position. And as I said to you, we've got 2 plans in the end game. For those of you who are sitting wondering, what plans are you talking about? Well, sign up for the mailing list below and you can get the notes, or go back and watch some of the previous videos. But it's real simple. In the end game, we've got 2 plans. Plan number 1, attack your opponent's weak pawns. Plan number 2, use your pass pawns. And that's going to be today's session, is the primary story that we're going to see, is he's going to be focusing on this idea of using the pass pawns. But now, let's take this interesting position. It is Capablanca to play. Yates has just moved his rook to c8. And we have an interesting moment where, fundamentally, Yates recognizes that queens are going to come off the board. And now Capablanca does something very instructive. Well, hold on. Let's try and get our bearings. Who do we think is better or worse? Because if we just look at the points, Yates has this rook for the knight. So shouldn't he be better? Well, as I said in the introduction, what matters is the activity of your pieces. What have your pieces done for you lately? What are they doing in this position? And that's the big theme here. I want you to focus on that. Don't just count points. Look at what contribution the pieces are making. And unfortunately, this rook on h6 is not a great contributor to black's position here. Not at all. As a matter of fact, black has no good pieces. But let's do a comparison. This knight, very impressive piece. Sitting on this outpost, cannot be moved, holds the pressure onto d6, doing a very nice job at this stage. Also, potentially escorting a pawn that might want to walk down the board. This bishop, technically a bad bishop because these pawns are fixed on light squares in the middle of the board. But boy, is it still active. Very, very important. So that bishop covers a lot of squares, also blocks up the only open file on the board. So all of these features tie together, and if we just talk about black's position, black's bad bishop, not so impressive at all, really struggling for moves. So overall, white is better, even though if we look at the so-called points count, black is doing better off. So Capablanca takes a simple strategy and approach here. He says, well, I'm happy to trade off queens. Why? Because if queens come off, this outside pass pawn becomes more dangerous. So he plays rook to c1. A nice finesse, not necessary. Capablanca does follow the principle. If you are happy to trade, try to get your opponent to trade for you. And that's certainly what happens in this case, because now the opponent decides, well, okay, he's going to move bishop d8. And at this point, Capablanca decides and says, well, I've done enough, and I get a little bit of extra material, captures, pawn takes, knight takes on e5. And now the point is, of course, the rook threatens the pawn, the e-pawn has fallen, a new pass pawn has emerged. This is all one-way traffic. This is not, as we've seen in the previous videos, one of the more difficult endgames for Capablanca to win here at this stage. Fundamentally, the poor black rooks do not have any open files. And at this stage, all of the pawns just keep falling. So we get this moment of king e7. Capablanca says, fine, I'll take the next pawn, and picks them all off. So here, his opponent plays pawn to f5. And now Capablanca, I think, is a little bit casual in his approach. Let's first just unpack and wake ourselves up. Why would pawn to f3 be a blunder in this position? Put it in the notes below. Put it into that chat. Let's see who's the first one who can point out why pawn to f3 is certainly not a great decision here. But Capablanca decides he's going to play his rook to c4. He doesn't want to give up any material. And let's talk also, he sets up this plan of threatening the opponent's weak pawn, putting a problem to the opponent. Fundamentally, we have to focus here and say, look, plan number one in the endgame is to attack the opponent's weak pawns. And the purpose and the intention there is to tie down the opponent, make the pieces less. If we just take a moment back here, pawn takes f5 would be tempting, but Capablanca doesn't want to be restricted. He fully understands that, look, if the king comes to d6, now he's going to have to play a move like knight to d3. He has to be very careful. There's a temptation to play knight f7 check, but of course black is doing very well here, because suddenly, earlier we were talking about the activity of the white pieces. Suddenly, the black king is the most active piece on the board, and the rook has a chance to get in the game. So Capablanca doesn't rush here. This is very instructive. When we have this position, the opponent wants to now disturb the position. Capablanca says, let me stabilize. Let's get all my pieces into the game. Let's form a plan. So rook c4. He doesn't want to win more material. He just wants to tie down the opponent, because it's not like black can just give up another pawn. So black decides to play bishop a5. Good. The bishop is a little bit less sitting out there on a5. What should we do now? How should we play? What's our plan of action here? Let's think a little bit about this in this moment. If you were playing here with the white pieces, what would be your approach? Because if we notice, right now the rooks are starting to look like they're doing things, trying to get into the game. At this stage, they don't have any open files. And it's actually quite interesting. Capablanca says, well, hold on. What kind of endgame do I want? I mean, 5, 6. Capablanca has 7 pawns. Every endgame is winning for Capablanca, even if it's a rook versus a knight. And that's the approach we want. We want to simplify here. But let's learn from some of Capablanca's earlier mistakes. We would prefer not to trade pawns. We want to trade pieces. So what do? We play this move, bishop to b5. Now, this is not the only move, but it's very instructive from Capablanca. The less pieces on the board, the more important pawns become, both their quantity and the quality. So the opponent trades, rook takes, we take back with the knight. Now, of course, the bishop is threatened. So the bishop moves to c7. What's our goal here? Should we play pawn takes? I mean, this pawn has been on offer for so long in this case. And now, for the first time, we can drop our knight back to defend the pawn. Remember, it's quality that matters. It's what your pieces and your pawns do for you. So here, no interest from Capablanca. He simply plays e5. Let's establish these two connected pass pawns through the middle. We're threatening d6 check. This is an utterly hideous position for black. They have no space, no chance for their rooks to join in. So the opponent plays bishop to f8. And here, I believe Capablanca gets distracted a little bit by fool's gold. Fundamentally, he should be demonstrating a very important thing: patience. He rushed in this one, understandably so. It's a wonderful position, and we all do this. We want to win and win now. The opponent is not threatening anything, nor can he create any great threats. So what should we do? Improve our worst place piece. That's the king. Capablanca should follow some of the earlier games we've seen that he's played. Let's try and get the king into the action. Once the king's ready to join in, then we start rolling along. Instead, he plays knight e3. Now, this is not in any way, shape, or blunder, but he's starting to play a little bit soon here. So rook to h7. He says, okay, I'll take another pawn. Check. King to f7. Now he pushes check. The opponent plays king to f6. I'm not a huge fan of this approach from Kappa, but by all means, let's finish this off. Why did he push e6 check? Because we're seeing plan number 2 in the action. Use your pass pawns. And that's exactly what he does here. He simply plays e7. Rook takes e7. Knight takes e7. And now king takes. Whoa! We've now got bishop opposite color. I hear some of you that are following on those notes, on those themes that we've been working on, and on the earlier videos, talk about our famous graph. Let's look at our famous graph of the most, shall we say, drawish endings and the most easily won endgames. And here we have our graph, the endgame difficulty spectrum. And this is a great guide. Those of you that are signing up on the email list will get this. And fundamentally, it gives you statistically a little bit of chessboard pro science in this case, where in very simple terms, the most difficult endgame for you to win with an extra pawn is bishop of opposite color endgames, because of the ability to create a fortress on the different color squares. Well, as we'll see with this one, that's not really the whole story, because there's a lot more pawns on the board in this case. So this is a very one endgame, but it's not as simple as we would like it. And that's why earlier I wanted to highlight Capablanca should have brought in the king. So now his king is way out of action, and it's put his win at risk. And I do want you to see that for your own games. When you've built such a convincing position as we saw earlier from Capablanca, don't rush. So now the king is going to have to join in, and that's the fundamental. It's very rare you're going to win an endgame without getting your king involved. Sometimes you can just run a pawn past and run it through because the opponent doesn't notice. But here, that's not happening. So now he's going to have to get his king in. But there is a small problem. This pawn over here could be a little bit of a difficulty. So he decides to play g3. And the idea is that he wants to get clarity on the king side. So his opponent plays bishop to c7. And we simply get king g2. Now we get king to d6. And then already the difficulty is starting to emerge. Do you see the kind of blockade that can now be established? Under normal circumstances, it's very easy to win. We have 3 extra pawns. But here with the bishop of opposite color endgame that Capablanca's brought about, this is one of the more challenging ones. So Capablanca turns around and says, you know what? I'm going to counterattack. I'm going to play bishop to e8. Not at all a bad idea, because if the opponent captures with the king, we go bishop takes h5, and now he can generate potentially 2 connected pass pawns on the side of the board. So Yates, damned if he does, damned if he doesn't, decides he's going to push h4, and then we get this move in this position where the bishop moves to f7, king moves to e5, and simply the king runs into h3. And now after the bishop drops into d8, king to g4, finally activating the king with the intention of tying down the opponent here. But I do want you to see he's got this pass pawn and he's got the a pawn. None of them are yet ready to run because of the fact that he just doesn't have the pieces ready. Very important cautionary tale for us to look at and understand how Kappa rushed into this endgame and maybe made it more challenging than it should have been. So now we get the capture. And I think the last instructive big moment of the game here, how should we take back? We technically have three options: the king, the f-pawn, or the h-pawn. So what are we looking to do at this stage? Well, in the opening, typically, we should take out of the center so that we accelerate our development. Then in the middle game, typically we take towards the center, so we increase our control of the center. But here it's not about the center. We want to take so we can generate a outside pass pawn. That is the big deal that we're looking at in this case here. Absolutely wonderful for us. So we get, of course, this wonderful moment. The f pawn will take onto g3 with this outside rook pawn being generated. King f6, bishop to e6, king moves across. Okay, do we push h4? Or is there another plan available for us? Remember, we want to use our pass pawns. The intention is to tie down the opponent, to stretch the opponent. So Kappa goes with this move d6. The idea is to try and get the pawn to d7, and of course, get it closer to promotion. It's not going to promote. I want you to see that problem with the bishop's a color, but it then completely ties down the bishop. So king f6, he plays bishop to f5, bishop to b6, and then d7. Now the pawn is secure. This bishop has to stay on this diagonal, and we simply get this moment of bishop d8, h4, captures, captures. The opponent is paralyzed, bishop c7, h5, we run along, king to g7, and now in the simplest of terms, he plays bishop e4. Actually, almost any move would do, but the winning plan is very simple. The king is going to run in and, of course, help this pawn promote. Once that happens, of course, he's a piece down, the other one promotes. And the black king has to be kept honest and has to sit and defend this pawn on the side of the board. Really very instructive endgame, and fundamentally, shall we say, one-way traffic. I do think, go back to that position where Capablanca had those pawns on d5 and e5, and some training. Set that up against a bot, an engine, and go give it a play in that one and see how you would approach it and what would you do, which I think is very nice. And I think that the crucial theme to understand in this one was not the material or the points as we looked at this. It was how easily Capablanca's pieces were able to create threats and how quickly the black position fell apart in this case. Very, very instructive, all because there was no harmony. There was no common goal of the black pieces in this one. So basically, we can say three things I think you can pick out of this game: that use and dominance of the center, where he had the pawns and the pieces fighting for the middle of the board. So that's centralization, and then he allowed him to convert. Then, of course, I want you to understand, don't just look at the points. Look at what your pieces do for you. Very, very crucial. And finally, try to play every move with an intention. If we notice with Capablanca, even though he had small little ideas sometimes, try to have an intent behind your moves. So I want you to think about the ideas of not always being focused on points, which I think is really good. And then finally, try to play some of those positions against the engines, because this is a very dominant victory for Capablanca, but I think valuable for you to practice as a theme. Finally, let's join in the next game, where we're going to jump in and have a really, really great situation with Capablanca in game 29, Winter against Capablanca from Hastings. This is a spectacular one where we introduce the concept of the winterized bishop and how a piece can be completely destroyed in a game, so much so that even though it's not captured, one side can be up a piece while it's still present. So join me in the next one, and let me know what you found most instructive from this video.